Matt Clausen and Teresa Phillips on our phone today, so they'll be chiming in when they so desire or when we call on them. We'll call the meeting to order now. And Ms. Wood, would you offer, or call the roll?
Mr. Clausen?
Here.
Ms. Phillips?
Here.
Here. Here?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Upchurch, would you lead it?
What?
Would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So our first agenda item today is an update on the strategic plan for Goal 4, which is our effective asset management and efficient use of resources. Shanna Seeley will join us in this presentation. There's two aspects to this today. One is the Goal 4 overview, and the second part is the budget development process.
Okay, so I use the mic for the, or the remote for this, right? Okay. And Casey, are you going to go over the first few slides, or do you want me to go and you'll chime in as needed?
Well, let me just step to the stage.
Perfect.
Go to the next slide, Shanna. Sorry, my mic was not on. So just as a reminder, here are our 5 goals and priorities. So we thought about the best way to frame this conversation based on some previous dialogue that we've had with both Mr. Taylor and Mr. Clausen. And the way we want to set the stage for our deeper dive is the why, the what, and the how. So I'm just going to touch on the why because it's important that we make sense of how anything that we do budgetarily represents our core mission, being a partnership of parents, our community, educators, and our aspiration to prepare all of our students to be successful learners, productive citizens, and caring contributors to society. In that process, we seek to develop each of our students' talents in a safe, nurturing environment and to inspire a lifelong love of learning. So we're just going to frame the question, what connections do we see between Goal 4 and the D38 mission as we dive further into the what and the how. So that's where Ms. Seeley's going to take us from there.
Okay, so the what is regarding our budgetary tools. So we have the CDE financial transparency, which includes required postings on the district website, which we are in compliance with. That information is held under the business and finance section on our website. Some additional tools and resources, the chart of accounts, obviously, which is set up by the CDE, and we follow that chart of accounts. The basic account code structure contains 11 dimensions, and we're going to go over those. And there is the link to that information on the CDE website. So for revenue accounts, here are the dimensions. So it starts with a 4-digit district code, a 5-digit admin unit, and a 4-digit school code. Those are CDE specific. They are assigned to us. And so we kind of cut those off when we do our internal accounting. So we start with the fund, the 2-digit fund. but we add back in those first three elements when we are doing our upload to the CDE so that it's, they know it's our information. So then we have a 2-digit fund, a 3-digit location, a 2-digit special revenue, and then we have a 4-digit program, a 4-digit source, another 3 digits that are optional to use, and then the last 4 digits are the designated grant project. So we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper, so I know it's a lot. And so just
Shanna,
hold tight.
May I ask a question, though? What's the difference between school and location?
We're going to get into that.
Okay.
So these are the revenue accounts. The expenditure accounts pretty much follow the same 11 pieces. The difference is that that 4 digits that is third from the end is considered an object instead of a source. And again, we're going to get into those details. So there's not much here in addition, but it does show that difference between the revenue accounts and the expenditure accounts. Okay, so here is the elements and the definition. So the district code is a unique code for each CDE reporting entity. D38 is 1080. Administrative unit is the unique code for the specific admin unit tied to that reporting entity. Our code is 21085. School code, each of our schools has a different assigned code. So for example, Lewis Palmer Elementary is 5096 and Bear Creek Elementary is 3539. So they all have a different assigned code. And so when we do our CDE upload, we make sure that everything that's specific to Lewis Palmer Elementary has that 4-digit code attached correctly, and Bear Creek and so on. So that answers your question between the district and the actual school codes.
I have another question, though. Does Monument Academy have one code, or do they now have 2?
They have 2 codes.
They have 2.
919 and 939.
And Grace Best does not have a code.
Grace Best, I would have to look that up to remember.
Okay.
I can let you know for sure. I believe they do have a code that's just not currently active. So then fund is the independent fiscal and accounting entity, that 2-digit fund. Obviously Fund 10 is our general fund. Location,
I'm sorry. So the fund itself ties into GASB, right? Fund accounting.
Correct.
So when we're audited according to governmental accounting standards, which are fund-based.
Correct.
So the fund is crucial for our financial reporting audit process.
Correct.
Got it.
And making sure that we are accurately assigning transactions to the correct fund. Location, this is a dimension that we use to identify the school, department, sites, etc. So that is also, again, all of these are determined by the CDE's chart of accounts, but these locations help us identify the different things, the different departments that we have. Like the finance office has its own location code. The special reporting element describes the activity for which a service or material object is acquired, much like a function. So this is an optional item to use. The program describes the activity for which a service, material, object is acquired. Programs are classified into 6 broad categories, and again, we're going to show an example of this. So there's instruction, support services, operation of non-instructional services, facilities acquisition and construction services, other uses, and reserves. So those are the 6 broad program categories. Then source/object. Source is a revenue account, object is an expenditure account. So those are used to identify the type of account that we're talking about. Job classification enables districts to break down expenditures for salaries and benefits by the employee's job classification. And then that's the 3-digit code that earlier was listed as optional. And then designated grant project, this is an award of financial assistance from another government to be used for a specified purpose. So that's obviously the grant number. And then the last piece is the amount. So that's the breakdown of our very detailed chart of accounts.
Which all school districts use.
Correct. Or are supposed to use, I guess, would be the way to say that. So our current budgeting model, using the chart of accounts, is we first break out budgeting by fund, then we break it out by location, then we break it out by program, and then we break it out by source or object. So an example would be Fund 10 is the general fund, location 110 is Lewis Palmer Elementary School, program 0010 is instruction, and the object, which is the expenditure, is going to be obviously variable depending on what the expenditure is specifically.
Now, because I've done this, I can go to the CD website and I can see that little piece of the pie.
Yes.
Because that's the way in fact, your monthly reports align with this as well, correct?
Correct.
So the monthly reports we get every month, the FP&A section, aligns to this, what you're describing.
Correct.
Perfect.
So here's an example from the 2021 budget for Lewis Palmer Elementary. And again, based on what the previous slide showed, location 110, program 0010, which is instruction, and then the object code is different. You're going to see salaries for teachers is 0110, salary for substitute teachers is 0120, and so on. And so this kind of helps, hopefully, make the chart of accounts a little bit more readable to you as we get into the next budgeting season. But this is an example of how we break down our budget currently. So this is first starting with Fund 10, then location, then program, then object.
And Shanna, it's been like this as far back as you've seen in our records, right?
Correct.
So it's not like you've changed anything.
No.
So when we've been told in the past that we are forecasting or accounting by location, we have been.
Correct.
Perfect.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so then the how, again, starting with the 21-22 budget development, we have some initial budgetary assumptions. So, and actually I think we've adjusted this a little bit since we put this slide together. So we're preparing for 3 different scenarios, which is still true. But our worst case scenario is going to actually be 7,600 per pupil instead of 7,000. So it's going to be based on current year numbers. The quote-unquote bad scenario is going to be a funding level of 8,000 per student. And then we're going to look at a sunshine scenario that's going to be 8,500 per student.
Have you
We may want to change the verbiage around that. I think when we had initially prepared for conversations with principals, I don't know that it's the best use of terms, worst, bad, sunshine. It's really flat based on where we currently are this year at 7,600 per pupil. And then depending on how much more at a state level that is allocated, I think we could look at, certainly 8,000 per pupil would not be bad.
No.
It would be
Good.
better,
Better.
and then maybe best.
Right.
So that might be one
Yeah.
tweak that we can just call out so that we're not creating a dimension of...
But again, based on what happened a year ago, we did worst case scenario.
Right.
Which was the least amount we would expect. Then we got to bump it up in December or whenever we got the new information.
And to back that point up one step further, Mr. Taylor, we have no indication currently from the state that we'll go any less than 7,600.
So hence, going into this coming year, the aim would be to stay flat. As
Yes,
the
sir.
worst case, I believe.
Correct.
Yes, and I think that is still fair to say a worst case approach
Be
is
flat.
76, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions by the board members? That's an important point here. Please, Ron.
Yeah, thank you. So we touched on this briefly last time, I believe. My question is, of the $7,600 per pupil, how much of that came through the federal COVID emergency funding portion, roughly? Wasn't it about $500-600?
No.
That was accounted for separately, wasn't it?
Correct. It was accounted for separately. We did get one payment in October that a portion of our monthly payment from the state was considered COVID relief money, and that was, if I remember correctly, about $52,000. But the rest of COVID money was accounted for separately. It was not part of our per pupil.
So is it incremental to the 7,600?
Additional COVID funding from the federal level?
Let me back up. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. We look at all the money we get in, and we divide it by the amount of students, and that's our per pupil number?
So I think it's really important to separate out the state level funding formula, which that's how we're basing our PPR amount. So what we're looking at there is state share and local share combined to form the 7,600. And then we look at the COVID additional funding, whether it is ESSER or CARES, whatever that additional pot of money is, we don't look at that as representing the per pupil amount.
Okay.
Correct. In fact, the CARES money goes through Fund 22, and PPOR is fully Fund 10 general fund.
So when we got together a year ago and had an off-site, and we went through some of this, the guidance we were getting was that the funding from the state could be as low as $6,900 and change per pupil, per
Correct.
person, or per pupil, or per student. So this indicates that at the end of the day, from state and tax dollars, it was up by about 10%.
That's correct.
Okay.
And then the CARES money came in as well, but it was spent specifically for the
Yes.
pandemic.
We certainly created a budget that was representative of funding streams from both state, local funds, as well as the additional COVID relief that we received.
Right. So one of the things we need to take into consideration is what are the reoccurring expenses that we likely see happening in a I don't want to say post-COVID, in a COVID-reduced world, and eventually a COVID exiting world, for lack of a more elegant term. And is that incremental to the 7,600 per pupil or inclusive, right?
No, it's incremental.
Correct.
An incremental expense potentially. Okay.
And the revenue, both are incremental.
That does have guardrails around how we can apply
Yes.
it.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the other component we just have to keep in mind.
Right. I think the term is ring fence in finance.
Good question, though. Tiffany, did you have a question?
I do. I just don't know if it fits into this context. So with the Joint Budget Committee forwarding the request for supplemental, how does that factor in? And I went on from the Colorado School Finance Project, and I tried to look at it, and it was so complicated. I didn't know where we stood.
Same for us too.
Yeah.
So I was trying to figure out, are we going to be one of those 103 school districts that might have fewer dollars in the current distribution?
No, we are not. And
Okay.
that goes back to our very conservative budgeting. Yes, I spent some time going through Tracy's email yesterday and really looking at it. We are in great shape because they based their numbers originally off of a student number of 6,593.5 FTE. We never budgeted that high.
Okay.
We budgeted a much lower student number, so we are in great shape and are looking at actually getting additional funds. So we are not one of the 103 districts that are going to be, quote unquote, losing money for this year.
It may be helpful to just speak to what our initial analysis, or at least what the state runs, have demonstrated would be the yield in that supplemental, because I think it's just helpful. It's not a done deal, so that's the one caveat we
Right.
just have to
Obviously.
call out. But
Yeah, they
Shanna,
won't
I think
mean
it would be
to-
helpful if you called out those specific numbers.
Okay, so based on their comparison, which actually is done based on the higher PPOR of 7664.94, which we started the year with, if you recall, and then we got a non-rescission, I guess, for lack of a better word, down to 7598, which is where we adjusted our final budget to. So keep those numbers in mind. So they are comparing going from 7664 or 76, almost 65, down, up to 7731, which is a change of almost $66 per
Right.
student.
I remember that.
But based on our lower budgeting number of 7598, going up to 7731, we're looking at more than that, obviously. So, again, I think we go back to our flexible budget that we've worked with has really proven to be a great model because we're going to be looking at additional money coming in even higher than what the state has projected on our behalf.
It's actually a really good question. That money's coming in for which year?
2021, this
fiscal-
year.
This fiscal year.
So we could see another $131 per student.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Which translates to around 2 point, what's the total amount?
I don't know, I didn't
2
do the
million.
math.
-ish.
131 times
64.
6,500.
6385 students-ish.
Oh, pardon me. 836,435.
Okay.
What was that number?
Interesting. About 800
836,435.
Yeah, about 800,000.
Right.
Good information.
So,
Good question.
yes, so again, we go back to, we budget conservatively, we use the flex budgeting model, and it has really been beneficial to us because we really looked at what an actual enrollment projection is, and we basically met or exceeded that enrollment projection as it was. But it was a reduction, and so budgeting to that degree of conservativeness, I guess, for lack of a better word, it has really paid
Saved
off
us?
for us this year.
Well, Shanna, it is fiscal conservative, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's all it is. It's a fiscal term, not a political term.
Correct.
All right, so Matt or Teresa, do either one of you have questions on that discussion around PPOR?
No. Excellent.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so then, again, looking ahead to 21-22, we're going to be doing nominal enrollment projections again. We don't know if this is going to come in higher or lower. It's going to be site-by-site based, obviously. And we are unclear on the impact of the additional stimulus, which is the ESSER 2. That is looking like an additional $1.2 million that we will have that can be spent through 2023. There will be limitations on how we can spend this. We're still awaiting clarification on that.
So essentially a 2-year window?
Correct. Mm-hmm. And then our budgetary priorities for 21-22, factoring in employee compensation, minimizing impact on instructional resources and programming, and address deferred maintenance issues, exploring how to leverage this Schneider partnership that we have.
So before we go on, Ron, I just want to reiterate what your questions were because, and then tell me if I've got this right, Shanna.
Mm-hmm.
So we may have an additional $2,800,000 of which is a current fiscal year adjustment to PPOR based
Correct.
on what the state's doing. The other 1.2 may, because it's not written in stone yet, may
Correct.
come in the form of the incremental costs of ongoing pandemic-related costs over the next 2 years.
Correct.
So that's roughly $600,000 a year. Compared to this year, we got about how much again?
This year, our CARES money was 2.5. We, after MA's portion, we had about 2.2.
So it's a significant reduction from what we had this year.
Correct.
But yet it hasn't disappeared. And so who knows how we match that up. That'll be part of the budgeting process.
Correct.
And I think the anticipation is there's significantly less need going forward as long as we continue on the track that we're on as a society.
And it's quite possible that it isn't 600,000 per year. It could be more first year and less the next year.
Be a little lumpier.
Right,
Correct.
right. So it was a good question, and I think you answered it well. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may, of equal importance, you budgeted on a conservative basis so that is all ring-fenced or incremental. So thank you for doing that.
So last week, we had 2 full days of meetings with principals to start the budgeting process. So the executive team met with each individual principal over the course of February 3rd and February 5th. We initially reviewed FTE and enrollment projections, discussed those, really nailed down where each principal thinks their specific campus is going to be. We reviewed the FTE working and the payroll spreadsheet, so they knew we went over every single employee at their campus. We reviewed operational expense budgets in detail, and we discussed the carry forward. And so our budget development projected timeline, we got a lot done in those 2 days with all 8 principals. We got a lot of information. And so by mid-March, we are looking to have the preliminary school and department budgets developed. We have the other departments set up for meetings coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we will be proposing a compensation package based on the current state context. In the April-May timeline, we will have an initial budget projection for the board, and then May and June timeline, we will finalize that budget, obviously. So the goal is to have everything really nailed down line by line so that when we get that first PPOR projection, we can plug that in and see where we're at. So with each of our 3 possibilities.
I do have a question.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
I have a question, Shanna. How are you adding an additional variance given the enrollment decline and just the variable of the difference in enrollment this year compared to the last 2 years? And how do you carry that variance through in terms of the budget?
So if you're asking our enrollment projection currently, we are looking at a reduction of 200 students is kind of what we're projecting out at this time. We will be adjusting that as more solid numbers come in over the next few months, but we are starting with a reduction in enrollment of 200 students across the district.
For the 21-22 school year?
Correct. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you have to start somewhere, but then have some ability to alter that up until June 30th, I guess?
Correct. Yes, we will be,
Okay.
that's where we're currently starting, but we will plug in new numbers as needed as we get more information as the months kind of go on and we get more enrollment information. But to start, we are going to be ultra conservative in that reduction of 200 kids. I don't think anybody believes that's really where we're going to end up, but we want to, again, be very conservative.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
You're welcome.
It raises another point, and that is, I would anticipate going into this budgeting season not with the idea of finalizing a budget in June, but doing similar to what we did last year, so that we can actually have our actual October count.
Correct.
Before
Yes, we will still
finalize?
do the flexible budgeting, but we will have to, quote unquote, finalize the proposed budget.
Understood. No,
Yes.
No, it's flexible as we
Correct,
go along.
correct. We are still going to continue
totally
with the
you
flexible.
on that. Teresa and Matt, are you guys still good with this concept of using the flexible budgeting approach month by month until, let's say, October?
That makes sense to me, especially considering we won't have some more firm numbers until October.
And
Yeah, it makes total sense to me.
okay, and Shauna, as you say, there's not much we can do other than start someplace, which you've done, and you've done that in collaboration with the principals. So, I mean, that's where we start, and that is conservative from what I'm hearing.
Correct, yep.
For example, I could say, well, why don't we just look at last year and say, well, we thought we'd be down, what would we say, 300?
Yes.
But then we actually got 50 more than that.
Right.
So we could say, well, this year we're going to be down 200, but we're actually going to get 40 more.
Right.
Now, where do we get the validation of that? It's a pure assumption based on the prior year. I'm not saying to do it. I'm just saying you could. That's another assumption you could use to not go quite so low. However, I'm not saying to do that. I'm
Right.
just using it as an example.
I would just add, I think, within the context of the conversations with each of our school principals, we are looking at this more so than just a year by year, what do we think is going to happen this next year? The trend data indicates that typically we do see quite a bit of enrollment between even March all the way up until August, September. So the complicating variable, independent of where we land with an initially approved and finalized budget, is how does that what are the implications for staffing?
Exactly.
And there's where we're having to really zoom in and say, what is this class size? Do we have an appropriate staffing ratio for a particular grade level where it could potentially go either way? So our principals are being very attentive and flexible themselves as we make sense of those elements. So what I would envision is that really month by month we can continue to monitor that trend, because what we don't want to be is in a situation where we're making a late hire as late as July or into August. That really makes it tough. But we also don't want to hedge our bets on a number that doesn't come in the way that we're going to project it. So it's really riding that fine line.
For a crystal ball.
Absolutely.
Ron, anything else?
No, thank
Or
you.
Tiffany?
Yes, Shanna, when we're looking at the timeline, can we make sure that we're being mindful and keeping in there that this has to be presented to DAC also, for DAC to look at and approve as well? And not approve, but to, go ahead. So last month's met the compliance. So in the past, don't we usually have DAC weigh in on what the budgetary like some of the priorities, and as well as the board weighing in on the priorities?
Yeah, and we did cover that at the last meeting.
Okay. I guess I just didn't remember DAC people weighing in. Okay.
True. Yes.
I do remember that.
I did ask the question and asked them that they could, and told them they could even email me after the fact if something came to mind that they didn't speak up about. But I would agree with Lori, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion.
Okay.
All right. We're going to do the three-legged stool.
Well, sure. And I'll attempt to bring a little bit of closure and then certainly open to more dialogue and questions. As you may recall, we used this same metaphor as we were talking about curriculum and our work around Goal 2. So I thought it was appropriate that we could translate this back to the same type of thought process. And so if we envision every single one of our students that sit atop our chairs, or literally our stools here, there are three legs under that stool. And so what we've shared with you a little bit here is the process from a why we do what we do to the what is involved to our how. And just to reiterate, the base of our stool remains our foundation, or as we also refer to, conditions for learning, which is that partnership of our parents, our community, our board, and all of us working together around these concepts. So that final slide just brings it right back full circle to the initial question that we posed.
So if I could be
Please, go for it.
Be so brave here.
Absolutely.
The how could be likened to instructional philosophy.
That's certainly an overlay that we could talk to.
And we don't have to do this. I'm just It's
Well-
where my mind goes.
Okay, fair enough. In terms of almost, yeah,
I know how it worked when we talked about curriculum
okay.
and teaching, right?
Keep going.
So I'm just
Keep going.
trying to now say, okay, well, I know one of the legs was instructional philosophy.
Yes.
Yep.
And,
Number 2.
and so we've got the why, the what, and the how
Yep.
for financial,
Yep.
which are the 3 legs I get.
Yep.
And they don't have to align. I'm just using it as an example to say that's what you're trying to do.
Yes. Essentially.
Yep.
Just a conceptual framework.
Well, I like it. I like it because I liked it before, and it's consistent. I got to think more about it, but I like it.
Mr. Taylor, one of the things you brought up in one of our planning meetings, which I really valued, was when we think about where Goal 4 situates in relationship to our other 4 goals, I think and you can certainly share your own words in this, Goal 4 is really almost that, I don't want to say foundation, but it supports or it uplifts every other goal, right? It's almost better situated, I think, as you said, as Goal 5, because it brings it all back into focus, because it's the tool or the vehicle that we're using to enable us to do everything else that we're doing.
Yeah,
Is that a fair way to?
It is. I liken it to just as communication is across all of the other goals, right? I mean, we have to communicate, and the thread of finance is a part of it, right? So it's the cost ultimately that runs through all the others. But I think communication is similar to that. So whether it's 4 and 5, I don't know that matters too much, because I think your communication protocols and planning are equally across the board.
Sure.
But
Point being, there's a lot of continued connection and overlap that we're seeing through each of the 5 that we continue to call out on a regular basis.
indeed. And I love that you ended with a question. For us to think about. And you've given us a lot to think about. Does anyone have any questions? Because this, I need to absorb. I need time to process all of this.
So I have a thought/question, and it's one of a perceived gap, and I may have missed a piece, and if that's the case, then I apologize in advance. When we began formulating these key goals, one of the things I seem to remember, and I checked back in my notes about that session we had, I think it was about a year ago, on an offsite, was to take a look at what we have in inventory in terms of physical assets, cash assets, human resource assets, and are we getting the proper level of return or utilization out of those? Pick whichever verb makes sense. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can ensure that that's either part of this goal, or if we choose to add another one, we take a look at it. Examples are, we're doing the work with GraceBest. That's an asset. And the question is the community, students, and the staff getting the best return out of what our choices are with it? We have raw land. We may have cash in certain places that are designated for things. And that's a wonderful opportunity for us to take inventory, make sure that everything we have is being used towards the key mission of the district.
I think, Shanna, I've seen some of your other presentations, other work, and everything you just mentioned are a part of it. Those are part of the finance department's projects, if you will, that support across the board. And GraceBest is one, the energy audit is another. So I think, Ron, it is part of this, and it's not spelled out here. The individual goals she hasn't added here. This is more philosophically, how do we approach it? But the individual goals I saw them in a presentation.
So it's someplace else.
Well, within this goal, it's just that those are rocks within the goal, I guess.
Okay.
And those will be changing all the time, right, depending on the season and the opportunity or the cost that we have to deal with.
If it's okay to just ask follow-up, you just want to make sure that it's looped into this somewhere. It just wasn't.
Yeah, and I mean, when we went through this a year ago, we thought it was critical that we made sure that we had a crisp understanding of what we had in inventory, so to speak, such that we were utilizing it in a way that maximizes return for the students, staff, and the community, right?
And I think a lot of that happens in these budget meetings as we're talking about, like you brought up, HR resources. So one of our largest, obviously, assets is our staff. And so we are talking through best utilization and, like Casey was saying, walking that fine line of making sure that we have the right staffing and not waiting until July and August. So that's one piece. If you look at the 5 bullet points under goal number 4, you'll see like make informed decision to determine future state of Grace Best. So that's obviously being done currently. So it's kind of ticking off one at a time to make sure that we are doing that exact thing that you're talking about, of making sure that we are utilizing our assets accurately, which includes not only staffing, but obviously what are we doing with Grace Best? What are we doing with the Schneider Electric project as well? So I think there's a lot going on. This presentation was probably mostly focused on budget because that's the current thing that is kind of at the forefront as these other projects are taking off, but maybe not quite ready to tackle in a presentation, if that makes sense.
Well, I think they'll show up in the budgeting process and the forecasting process, because at some point we have to say, we have to recognize there's limited resources. Add them all up, and we have a limitation. But we have many opportunities. And I hope that we get to a budget model that says, okay, if we decide to do Grace Best, how does that impact compensation?
Correct.
Or if we do a raise, how does that impact Grace Best or any others? So it's not one project. It's, you make your assumptions, you have your choices. Once you start saying what ifs, then you see what the results are. And I think that's what you're alluding to. I'm not
Actually, I'm alluding to, I'll be very, very, very specific. The one thing that we spoke about that we haven't seen yet, and I don't know if the district's ever provided it, so this is not a ding on what we're doing at all. We need to have a list of all the assets. We need to say, look, we have this much land, we have this many buildings, we have this much cash, we have this much pulled out for reserves, we have this much left. The question is, are we getting great utilization out of it? The answer might be absolutely. But we've never shown our owners what they have.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, as an example, we own some land out on the southeast side of the school district.
Sure.
That doesn't have a cost on our books, but it is an asset. The reason it doesn't have a cost on our books is because a developer had to donate it as in kind versus the cash. And so there's an asset, and it's not the only one. So I think the question that you're asking isn't just about the historical costs that we have on our books, but actually all the properties and what might their values be.
It's just, what do we own? And are we getting utilization out of it? Ms. Upchurch has said several times, I thought it was very elegantly said, we're not saving for retirement. We want to make sure that we're fiscally conservative and that we always have plenty of money for a rainy day or a pandemic or the next event that's going to come down the road. There will always be something. But with respect to that, what else do we have? What are we utilizing? Grace Best is a phenomenal example of an exercise that's one of our assets. But I'd like to see, and I'd be happy to work on it, not just ask for it, one piece of paper or one slide says, look, here's the physical assets we have. Here's the excess cash we have. Here is whatever else I haven't thought of yet. And here's how column 1, column 2 is here's how we're utilizing it. And column 3 is there an opportunity to utilize it for something better? Are we really getting on a 10 scale a 7 or above in terms of utility? That's all. It's good for us to understand that as a leadership team, and it's highly important for our owners to understand what their assets are being used for. And if the day ever comes that we choose that we want to add an asset and there's an expense to it, then we've got a valid foundation from which to begin that conversation. Today we don't.
So 2.5 years ago, we did a tour of the district in a big minivan. And we saw the properties that exist that didn't cost anything, so they don't reflect really. And I think that's one part of what Ron's talking about is, we do have some acreage in multiple locations that has some value, even though it's no cost on our books.
Correct.
And it's just one thing, because as he said, there's probably things we haven't thought of yet.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Takes time.
Yep.
So how quickly are you guys expecting that? Because I want to make sure that we're
not at least till Friday.
Looks like April, May, June. I mean, is this urgent?
No, it's just important.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. It's important for us to have that clarity.
Right.
Because obviously there's just a few things that we're...
There's 1 or 2 things on the agenda that are
so
pretty time
happy
sensitive.
to develop that
Yeah.
in a comprehensive way. I just think the time that's involved will need to be mindful of.
And as one board member, I'm happy to help, so that's not all on the staff.
Makes sense. Appreciate that.
All right, anything else?
Teresa or Matt, any other comments or questions on this presentation?
I was just going to add, if I'm understanding Ron correctly, that these 5 goals that are in front of us, I flip back to one of the first slides, they all have a foundational component. But I think, Ron, if I'm understanding, I think there's also a parallel focus on what's the action orientation for each goal. And I think that's a good lens to look through in terms of, I think we can get a little entrenched in the foundational aspect, and I do it in my own personal life and then don't necessarily take action. But so I think that's what you're speaking to, Ron, and I think it's a good lens to have for all of us as board members and as a board member or as a board as a whole, just to keep the balls forward.
Anything, Matt? Thank you, Teresa. Matt, was there anything you had? Are we good?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Shauna. This is very helpful. I appreciate everybody's input and feedback today for Shauna. I think that adds a lot of clarity and depth to what we're doing. And I appreciate that, the active involvement of our board.
Thank you, Shanna.
So I'm glad you put yours first, unlike our regular meetings. So, Dr. Summers, I think we'll start with you today.
Okay. Well, I did not prepare anything formal in the way of a PowerPoint or document per se, but I think the topic that's on everybody's mind relates to communication that went out yesterday to specifically our secondary school staff. So I'm going to do my best to give you, just call it a 30,000-foot view, but I think there's some details that fall into place. And probably the best way to do this, Mr. Taylor, with your permission, is I'll give you guys at least a summary of what the current situation or trends are, and then really just field this more from a place of question and helping us situate where next steps are. I'll be leaning too on members of my team as those different questions come up, so be ready, team. I think the best place to start is just helping us know that El Paso County officially moved to yellow on the dial. This occurred over the weekend. It was officially on Saturday. In addition to that move into yellow, we are also now operating on a dial 2.0 framework. And really what that means is previous iteration of the dial was accounting for the metrics, including incidence rate, positivity, and hospitalizations on a 14-day window. So if we recall going all the way back to November, December, our move into red, we were in red for, I want to say it was a good month and a half. Came back from the break, didn't necessarily see the increase that I think was being anticipated after the holidays in terms of a drastic uptick. What we saw instead was a gradual decline. That decline took us into orange, where we had been, I want to say, about 4 weeks. Is that right, Mr. Frampton, give or take? And then now coming into a yellow state, what we are anticipating, and a little bit of this is reading a crystal ball. I'll just use that as a disclaimer up front. Hard to know exactly how all of those dynamics are going to play out in terms of the numbers, but currently we are seeing enough of a trend in a decline that the move into yellow may end up actually being a move into blue and even potentially green at some point in the next couple to few weeks moving forward. As I say that, I think it's also fair to say if the trend were to reverse, then of course we see the dial move back or forth, depending on how you're looking at it, into a yellow state or into an orange or a red state. With all of that said, within the current confines of capacity restrictions and recommendations provided to us at the state level, specifically CDPHE and the governor's office, within the grid itself that corresponds to our position in the dial, it's very clearly articulated as P12 schools that when we're in yellow, that in-person learning is quote unquote suggested. And acknowledging that, there is definitely some questions that we have been fielding for some time around, so what does that actually mean? How does that translate to our current state within our schools? And I think we would be remiss if we didn't begin to at least have the conversation around what exactly does that potential for return to in-person look like. Now, we took a pretty bold step yesterday. And in that step, what we accounted for was, number one, the community context of transmission rates that we're currently seeing. Number two, while not called out in my letter to staff, we are seeing much fewer incidents relating to either positive cases, isolations, or quarantines. And that's not just in our secondary schools, that's across all of our schools. I think we've seen some of the lowest rates from some time. And if you recall back in January when we went into deep discussion about this, typically what we are seeing is that the transmission rates or the incidence rates within our schools are very reflective of what we're seeing in the community, or vice versa. Essentially, they correlate to each other. So that has prompted some conversation and a position of, if we can move back, and I'll just put my own stamp on this, I have said from the very beginning, if we can, then we probably should. And that's across the board, right? Within that can process, created a great deal of flexibility and choice for students and families, and our staff have been extremely diligent and very dedicated to making several adaptations. Not easy at all, but nonetheless a function of responding to what the needs and what the different dynamics of our different models are. So with all of that said, we know that we are currently in a hybrid teaching model which is only yielding 2 days of in-person instruction for our kids, given the constraints of that schedule. At this point in time, we currently identified an initial target date of February 22nd, which was 2 weeks from yesterday, to begin our preparation efforts and plan to ultimately see our kids have the ability to return to a 100% in-person learning model as of February 22nd, with a few caveats. Among those is, number one, as I mentioned at the beginning, the dial could easily move the other way. So we could, a week from today, look at the trend and say, hey, we're back into orange. That's how flexible I think the dial is going to become as we continue to see how we're moving forward through this. So if that were the case, we have called out that that may not be the best way to move forward. February 22nd may be too early. That's just a fact. We also may see beyond the movement on the dial. We put a disclaimer in the letter that said it's not just a function of where we're at in the dial, because what happens if we see multiple cases in our schools that lead to multiple quarantines? Well, that's not prudent at that time to necessarily continue to say February 22nd is the day to push back. In addition to that, we recognize that our staff are just now beginning to receive invites if they have indicated their desire to be vaccinated. We believe that more and more of our staff, hard to put an exact number on it, but that the trends will see more opportunities for our staff to be vaccinated, as we know that timeline was pushed up by the governor. So beginning to, or yesterday, into this week and into the next couple of weeks, it's very possible that we see a high degree of our staff that can begin to at least get the first dose of the vaccine. So we'll see how all that translates. Briefly, I can tell you that there is a mass vaccination event that is scheduled for this upcoming weekend, February 13th and 14th at the World Arena. I believe more and more of our staff will be getting an invite as that event becomes closer. We'll have a better sense. We're asking our staff right now to just tell us or tell our nurses if they are getting the vaccine and where that puts them in terms of a timeline. My understanding of that process is that they'll not only receive their scheduled first shot, but there will be a second shot that's scheduled as well for 3 weeks following that initial event. So that puts us at about, I believe, a March 6th, March 7th timeframe in terms of staff. Again, a prevalence of staff ideally being able to receive the vaccine. The other component that we definitely need to be mindful of is where our students and families may situate as this move becomes imminent to 100%. What does that mean for a student who is currently in a hybrid schedule model? To what degree do we accommodate choice in that process? We anticipate that there may be some students and families who just are not going to feel completely comfortable going back into a 100% environment. And I think there's more that we can just unpack in terms of what does 100% actually mean and what does that look like logistically. But what do we do about students who are not going to be attending in person? Currently, the game plan would be to still allow them to access the course synchronously, whether that's because they don't want to be in attendance, or they could be quarantined, they could be isolated. There's other variables that may come into play there. So I think that sets a lot of the dynamics. Oh, one other is, at this point in time, we would envision still maintaining the same semblance of the instructional model, being a 4-day in-person schedule, with Fridays still reserved at our secondary schools for that Flex Friday component. There's different things that come into that we can talk to as well. But I think that creates at least the initial landscape, sort of that 30,000-foot view. I can tell you some of what we're hearing from some of our staff thus far. We did create a feedback form because we specifically wanted to understand the questions, the needs, the concerns. I definitely want to be fair to our staff and say that it is it's a lot for them to digest. There's a lot of emotion behind the announcement. There's still a lot of questions about it. There may be some frustration about it. There may be excitement about it. I would say it really meets the whole continuum of what we would anticipate in a big announcement such as that. The other component is we have yet to formally communicate with our families or community. One of the reasons I wanted to pause on that was to engage in this dialogue with our board, to understand more of where our staff's perspectives are coming from, but certainly we need to make sure that we're communicating this in a formal way to both our families and our students in that process. So there's a whole lot there. I'm sure you have many questions or thoughts, so let's just dive in from that perspective, Mr. Taylor, and thanks for letting me do the initial overview in that manner.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. Matt, do you have anything you'd like to start with?
No, I don't. It looks like we're making some good steps. We're being respectful of our teachers and their concerns. We're also cognizant of the challenges that many of our youth are facing, and as well as getting them back. So with that being said, I have no questions.
All right, thank you, Matt. Teresa?
Yeah, understanding the balance that all of this takes and that it's obviously multifactorial. Casey, I'm just wondering about your thinking with regard to what's known in research about durable immunity being imparted 2 weeks after the second dose of vaccine. And what about considering a reopening to full-time in-person learning as soon as every teacher who has accepted the vaccine has durable immunity?
So Teresa, that's a great question. I'm going to invite Rick to help address some of that, but I'll take a first stab at it and I'll repeat the question so we're all working off the same page there. Essentially what I'm hearing is, what do we know about the effectiveness of the vaccine? To what degree is there immunity that's achieved after the first dose compared to having the second dose to be, I'll use the term fully or more completely immunized? I think it's fair to say my first response to that, and then certainly would love Rick's take on this as well, is we are hearing that after the first dose, there is a period of time, it's about a 3 to a 4 week period of time, that there is effectiveness in terms of what's the term you were using, Teresa? What type of immunity did you mention?
Durable.
Durable?
Durable immunity, and that comes from the call that I was on January 26th with El Paso County Health Department.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for reiterating that. So I would say also beyond that the first dose does not preclude a staff member from being quarantined or potentially even isolated, depending on either exposure to a known positive case or to, if that staff member is exhibiting symptoms, we would implement the same protocols. It doesn't change the guidelines that we would still be following in the event that occurs after a first vaccine. So certainly there's a case to be made, and I think it's something we are hearing from our staff right now, that it may be more prudent to wait until all staff have received not just a first dose, but a second dose. Mr. Frampton, anything that you would?
No, I agree. We are in weekly meetings with the health department in which they're continually assessing the impact of that first dose. And as of this moment right now, we have not received any guidance in which we would change our practices for a teacher or any person who has had one dose of the vaccine. So from a practical standpoint, nothing will change until the second dose is administered. If the county or the CDC at the national level starts to realize that there's a higher level of effectiveness and they change their practices, we will be notified immediately because we are meeting with them regularly.
So a follow-up question on that topic specifically. Is there any science or guidance that talks about the efficacy of once someone has received the second vaccine? In other words, very specifically, if a large portion of the staff is getting a first vaccine in 5 days and 3 weeks later they get a second vaccine, does that reduce the risk of them getting infected following the second vaccine, and does that warrant consideration in terms of moving the date to the right a little bit if it's close? Of course, the sub-question is what percent of the staff that's student-facing is going to be immunized, right?
Yeah, and we're going to be tracking the number of staff who are receiving the immunizations. Now, it's a private health record, so I don't know if we're going to be able to give that information to you with 100% accuracy. We're asking staff to report their vaccinations, but there's no requirement. So, yes, after they've received their second vaccination, they are no longer needing to isolate if they're symptomatic. They would just stay home as if they were otherwise sick, and there's no need to quarantine if they're exposed. The reason I think that's going to be most beneficial for us is just the raw numbers of students that a teacher comes in contact with every day, especially when they're an active entity in a student's learning, is at our secondary levels is in the hundreds of students every single day. And if in fact they are now protected from needing to quarantine, or any student is protected from needing to be quarantined from their exposure, that is going to reduce our number of quarantines substantially, because teachers are a major impact in our schools when they're considered a close contact and we have to quarantine from them. And if we're in school full time, it's well over 100 students per teacher every day.
Right. Once somebody receives a second dosage of a vaccine, are they immediately inoculated, or is there another gestation window?
We are proceeding right now as if it's an immediate removal from the quarantine list, but I'm going to seek out additional information as we're getting more folks quarantined or vaccinated for that second dose, just to clarify that. So I am not comfortable answering that with 100% confidence.
But Ron, if I could chime in on that, the word on the street, it's not scientific, and I'm not a doctor, so I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just telling you the word on the street is that after the second vaccination, there's about a 24-hour period where the person actually gets some of the effect of COVID-19. It's not from COVID-19. It's from their body reacting to the vaccine to prepare the immunity. So for 24 hours after the vaccine, second, I doubt if they're going to want to be at school.
Yeah, this is anecdotal, I know, but we've had multiple staff, our school nurses and our staff working with our most medically fragile students already received their second vaccine. That's happening this last week. And it's been hit or miss on which of those have felt yucky, and that's the word they're using. It's a low-grade fever and just not feeling really good. And some have reported to me that they've had no symptoms whatsoever after the second shot, and it's been fine. So it is hit or miss there.
And likewise, along those same lines, those who have had COVID and are survivors, when they get the first vaccine, it's as effective as if it's the second, because they've already began the process of building their own immunity. And that's from scientific journals, so that is a good source of information. So those are just two anecdotal kind of replies to your question about that.
It sounds like it's an art, not a science at this juncture. And so to get the kids back in the classroom in the safest way possible is everybody's objective.
Yeah,
right?
and while we were hoping that we could get everybody in the district immunized immediately on day one, I mean, we even requested having them come to us and do a mass vaccination in one of our sites. And that obviously did not happen because there's not enough vaccine, so they're spreading it out with random calls to our staff. The drawback to having everybody vaccinated within a small window of time would be everybody would feel yucky at the same time, and we might have an impact in our classes. So the fact that we're spreading it out a little bit helps the impact of the time it takes to get the vaccine and the number of people who would be out on any given day after their second vaccine. So there's pros and cons to that.
Are the principals telling us what percentage of their staff is going to be immunized, so we can get an estimate, at least if we can't get
I have that
some kind of
information.
anonymous data?
Yeah, I have the information on how many people have requested a vaccine, so I can tell you that I have that number, and it includes Monument Academy. So we do have the number of folks who've requested the vaccine. And like I said at the beginning, we're asking folks to report once they've received it, so we have a good
But is,
sense.
is that on a student-facing basis, 50%, 20%, 75%, 90%, 2%?
I didn't factor that, and so I'd need to go back and do some quick math off that.
I think the general range is around 75 to 80% of staff
Okay, that's significant.
that have requested. Our understanding from Centura Health is who we are partnering with as a health provider to arrange for the invitations to these vaccinations has told us that their goal is for everybody on the list, which is a bold goal because that's not just D38 staff, that's across the entire, well, it's El Paso County for us, but it goes statewide as well. Their number that they alluded to was about 10,000 staff within the county that they have set a target of this mass vaccination event. I think they're trying to get to as many people as they possibly can. One of the frustrations that I know our folks are already feeling a little bit, but I anticipate it to evolve as we go through the week is, but I still haven't received that appointment. Well, they just started going out yesterday. So I believe that we will begin to see more and more of those invitations hit our staff's email boxes. We've done everything that we need to on the back end of that to make sure that they're actually receiving those emails. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, and we'll have to see how this bears out, that we'll see a vast majority of our staff that have requested the vaccine to be invited to the mass vaccination event this weekend with the intent that their follow-up second dose would be the weekend of March 6th, 7th. So we'll just keep a close eye on those pieces. Hopefully I'm not speaking too boldly there. So to piggyback on that point, I do think there is a dynamic that would suggest that there are just based on initial feedback that we're receiving from some of our staff, there's a higher degree of comfort and confidence that they would prefer to wait until the vaccines have actually been distributed before we really start. They are looking at February 22nd as possibly too early. I think that's one of the questions that I would like to process just more with you all is, where do we set that goalpost? Is February 22nd pushing us back too fast, too soon? Again, we're breaking out our crystal balls on this a little bit. On the other hand, it's also important for me that we are not setting ourselves up to just continue to move the mark. I don't want to create a dynamic where we say a date and then we change a date and then we're going back and forth. I think there's that dynamic that I want to.
In all due respect, I'd
Please.
like to hear from Tiffany
Please.
on this first before we jump there.
Okay.
I want to go there with you, but
Thank you.
I want to make sure everyone has a chance to talk on this first issue. Do you have any comments?
So my my thought that comes to mind is that some have concerns, and those concerns are valid for different individuals, and I think we have to be mindful of that, while at the same time we need to look to what the experts say and not the armchair quarterbacks. And when our county says that it's suggested at this dial to be back in school, and the director of the CDC says that vaccinations of teachers is not a prerequisite for safely opening schools, and that's a direct quote. That was going to be my question, which actually would have segued into exactly what Dr. Summers was going to say, is, so where does that put us?
No, it's a great question. And we want to address that first.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that I want you all to be aware of is since we've returned in January, we've had 71 positive or probable COVID cases in Lewis Palmer. We've had over 800 quarantines. And that's in what, a month?
Mm-hmm.
Today's the 9th of February. So little less than a month, we've had already 71 impacts, or positive cases. We currently, as of today, have 16 students with a positive case and 1 staff member. So this has not gone away. The
Right.
dial's dip into yellow has not, it hasn't reflected in the schools as being a zero. I received a text from one of our principals at 7 a.m. today saying the quarantines are killing us. We currently have 24 staff in this district who are quarantined today. And that's a fairly substantial impact. Finding subs for those 24 staff members is very difficult. Some of those staff members can't receive substitutes because of the unique aspects of their job. So we have 216 students out. So my biggest concern in returning is the impact a sick student is going to have at our high school or middle school level in the number of quarantines. It's going to continue no matter how vaccinated our staff become. I think that'll help. We're still going to have to be dealing with targeted contact tracing, identifying students who have a potential of being a close contact, and we're going to be quarantining. So there's going to be disruption in learning because of the quarantines for a while. And there is no magic date that we can pick that's going to prohibit that from being part of it. So when we open full-time in secondary, we need to know that we're doing so with the increased risk of quarantines to continue, and that's a significant inconvenience for families. And I think the disruption of learning due to quarantines is a factor we have to consider, not just what the CDC is telling us and that piece. I think if we just looked at the dial and the data and the articles coming out of the CDC at the federal level, that would be narrow-minded in looking at all of the information we need in order to open safely and consistently across the learning environment. When you lose a portion of kids, so as a teacher, if I were sitting in front of a classroom of students and a third of my kids were out to quarantine, that becomes a very difficult task for me to ensure all 100% of them are receiving a robust education. Where in our current situation, where we're keeping those quarantines at a minimum, there's a lot more continuity and consistency that I can ensure a high level of education. So that's the tightrope we have to walk, is where's the county, where's the Fed saying this is an appropriate time, and where's our staff saying this is what we still need in order to take care of our kids. There is not going to be a magic number, date, or time in which it's, the flag goes up and it's like, okay, today's the day we need to do it. So it's going to be a tough call. And if we make the decision, when we make the decision, it's not if, but when we make the decision to return, we have to be aware that the impact, it's still going to have impact on learning because of quarantines. And that impact will increase in our high schools and middle school.
Well, isn't that been a factor, a huge factor in how we've been able to maintain the learning we have, is based on the quarantine and the logistics of it. How many staff do we have? How many students do we have in the classroom? And that really does play a logistics factor into what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Yep. And it's the more kids you have in a close area, the higher impact a single sick person is going to have. That's just the simple facts of the matter. And that doesn't mean, in my mind, we don't ever do it. I think we just have to weigh out the pros and cons and manage those risks to the best of our ability.
Can I follow on to your question? So you mentioned earlier that you meet with the El Paso County Health weekly, I think you said. And they have relaxed these quarantine or contact tracing standards once, correct?
Well, they're the same today as what they were before the huge spike in October. So they've increased them and then relaxed them.
Did they go from 10 to 7? There was a change, wasn't there, going from 10-day quarantine to 7?
Oh, yes, that is true, correct.
That's what I meant when I said relax.
From 14 days to 10 days in the quarantine length of time.
7 is with a test that is negative.
Okay.
So that's the only way you can come back with 7. It's a 10-day quarantine, essentially, is the
And the county is recommending we do not use the 7-day
Not to rehash what it is. The question I want to ask is there any discussion of once vaccines are in place, will they relax those any further? Because the data suggests there are certain individuals that are at risk. Generally speaking, it's not students. So once we have full vaccination, will they relax these standards? Because that is your biggest hurdle of maintaining
Absolutely.
secondary school.
Yes, I don't know the answer to that question. I agree with you completely that the length of time in quarantine is a major impact on learning, and it does tie our hands. And if they do reduce that, or if the county comes out and makes recommendations that moving to a shorter time period is in the practice and the practice we should engage in the schools, that will help us considerably. As of today, I have not heard any discussion
Understand.
on that.
But would you ask that? Because,
Absolutely.
you know, the concept that you've talked about here, the biggest issue is contact tracing. And it will continue to be so. In fact, it may be a bigger issue if we go full time here.
It will.
Maybe.
Yes, that's a great question.
So the question I'd be pushing back to El Paso County Health with is, will there be some level of relaxation of that quarantine period if indeed our teachers are vaccinated? Because that would make a huge impact.
Huge. I
Teresa?
agree.
Yeah, they spoke to that a little bit in the call that I was on the 26th, and I think what it comes down to is schools become the catch-all of community transmission. So even if you had 85 to 100% of your teachers vaccinated, all of us are interacting in our greater communities. So from a public health standpoint, they don't consider there to be herd immunity until there's 85% of the entire population vaccinated. So I think it's important to consider that community interaction with the school employees as well.
Well, Teresa, I hear what you just said, but I've also read and heard that the schools haven't been acting as the spreader. In fact, most cases aren't picked up at school, they're brought to school. Is that a fact, or am I misunderstanding that?
I think that's
Well,
true. Oh, go ahead, Teresa.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of the other things they said is that, you know, the schools are fundamentally where people come together. So, and they also have strong reporting requirements. So, you know, in the data, when you look at the COVID dial and whatnot, or the data there, you see the numbers of cases in the school systems more so than you see numbers coming from, say, restaurants or other places where community members interact more. But the schools, you know, generally are showing good protocols and are mitigating their risk really well. What would change once you go to full time would be that some of those protocols are going to change. And I know that Rick and Casey can speak to more specifics about that than I can, but that was just some of what I heard. I thought it was helpful.
Well,
Not
I appreciate that. I appreciate that question, and I would like one of you to address what protocols will change.
The biggest stress point or pressure point, if you want to refer to it that way, is going to be our class sizes doubling in a space that does not guarantee the same type of social distancing that we've been able to employ. So I'll translate that into you might have 15 kids that are currently in a classroom that you can have at least a desk or two in between. And now you're saying, well, we've got 30 desks and 30 kids, and you can't guarantee 6 feet. You may not be able to guarantee 3 feet. You're going to have 30 kids. Now, one of the approaches to that from at least a contact tracing methodology is we would suggest or almost require that teachers develop seating charts that create what we would refer to almost as mini pods within that bigger classroom environment. So you have this group of, let's say, 4 to 6 kids that are in this particular area of the classroom that you know that's who's sitting there and that's who's already within that zone of exposure. And then you maybe have 4 or 5 of those spread out throughout the classroom to the best of your ability. I can tell you some teachers in some classrooms say, we can do a seating chart, but you're still going to have kids that are bleeding over into each other, so to speak. So that's one dynamic that I think is most most stressful from a teacher's mindset in terms of how they position things within their classroom. The other times that I think create pressure points within the day, lunch. We've already had initial conversations about, is 2 lunches even possible given all of the increase in the number of kids that will be going through the lunch line. So even independent of where the kids are seated, we are struggling right now to have even enough staff to be able to ensure that all the kids are going to be able to get their lunch and eat it and have enough time to do those pieces.
But the same protocol's the issue is
Protocols-
physical distancing.
Yes, that's the factor. And then I think the other times are going to be naturally passing period, which we could certainly talk about staggering. There's also the arrival and the departure time. So anytime you have mass amounts of kids that are arriving or leaving school at any given day, those are probably the 3 most pronounced difficulties that I think we know we would have to anticipate. Certainly, we would still be requiring masks. Certainly, we would still be
Cleaning.
working toward cleaning, although there has been some concern expressed about the frequency of cleaning and how prepared are we to do everything that we can to keep the desks and other items clean that are within the classroom. So those are, I think I covered most of them there. Those are the big pressure points.
So great question, Teresa. Did that answer your question?
Sure, and I'd like to loop around, and I didn't entirely hear Rick, but I just wanted to add that, asking a question about vaccination with regard to durable immunity and teachers, I don't want anyone to consider pitting teachers against student well-being. I think it's really important that all of this is in the context of sort of the long game in terms of opening the schools that in a way that's as consistent as we can make it. So that was my point in initially asking that question.
Mm-hmm. Great point, too. Great point. Well, I will just add to your comments that
Yes.
you're anticipating a lot already of more volume, more kids, less space. And I appreciate that. And I can't even imagine in my mind what every teacher might be thinking. But I do see some of the replies to this, the letter that went out. Matt, did you have a comment you were going to make? I heard your voice. No?
I did not, Chris. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me add a couple things here too, and it just questions based on what I've heard. So you'd mentioned that there's the invitation that's going out for this mass event. The question I really want to ask is, you've got sign-ups, you know who wants or is willing. Is there any way of prioritizing that list based on risk category?
That's probably the most common question I've received since this entire process has started. And the easy, quick answer is no. The county is in a process of just getting everybody done as quickly as possible. And if we started putting criteria for risk factors together, first of all, obtaining that information would be a big lift for us as a school district and probably goes beyond our scope. But then secondly, comparing that with other folks across multi-districts in the entire region would be very difficult. So we have just submitted all of the folks at the same time who showed interest, and they randomized it and sent that out to everybody.
And then obviously you're doing all you can to make sure that everyone has the access, because it's up to the individual at the end of the day, right?
Yes,
Very good. And I was going to raise, but Teresa raised it already, was, we've talked a lot about the impact on teachers, the risk to teachers, but there is a risk to students. Mm-hmm. And this year, this last 12 months, we're in the 12th month of this pandemic, it's not been good for students. There's no way I can find anybody who says, this is the best year I've ever had. Mm-hmm. And then that's unfortunate. That's nobody's fault. It's the pandemic. But the reality here is, in this plan that you've been describing and the letter that you sent out, and we as a board have always said, kids first. Now, like Teresa, I'm not trying to pit teachers versus students. That's not the aim here. But there's been very little conversation about this. And we've talked about testing and how do we know what our progress and growth has been this year? What's our achievement levels? And then we hear about, well, maybe we'll, have variances and all sorts of things that doesn't really measure what's happened this year. It's going to take maybe years for us to really know the impact of this year. So conceptually, the idea of going back to school, Teresa or Tiffany made the comment, the CDC says today, without vaccines, it should be okay to have kids in school. That's not coming from us. That's coming from the Center for Disease Control. Much like being in yellow. It doesn't come from us. It's where we are. And what I've appreciated so much about you all is the agility from last March through today in dealing with the pandemic. Unbelievable. You guys have done a better job, you guys and gals have done a better job, in my opinion, than any other school district in this state. Now, moving back, where you're at now is like, wait a minute, now we can do more normal school. As you move back, the risks are still there. The pandemic will be an endemic. It's not going away. I don't know when it'll go away. We may have to have boosters every year. I mean, we don't know yet. It's a crystal ball. There's so much we don't know. I love the fact that we want to get our kids in school because I hear all the time, oh, my kids are really struggling. I hear it all the time. I see it in my own home. One of the things that concerned me when I read the letter is this. Therefore, we are currently targeting Monday, February 22nd, 2021, as our return to 100% in-person learning at our secondary schools. I read that, and my reaction was, how can that be? Because we just took away choice. There is not going to be 100% of all children going to school. I think what you mean, is you'll have an option for your children to go 4 days a week with the Friday Flicks Day, and you will have an option to dial in to synchronous learning. Am I misunderstanding this?
No, I think, and this is where I would also invite Dr. Benton to help us with this part of the dialogue. The instructional model that we are currently implementing within our hybrid schedule is such that the synchronous learning component that is happening on the non-in-person days, that will not go away. That is essentially what we have to maintain between now through the end of the school year.
To make sure I understand.
That will not go away.
Okay, but I want to make sure I understand what you just said. What I heard you just say is that we have cohort A and cohort B. So on Monday, cohort A goes to school in person. Cohort B dials in.
Correct.
So there's 100% of the class every day. Some in person,
yes,
and some dialing in.
That's correct.
The next day, Tuesday, cohort B
flips,
goes in to class. Cohort A dials in.
Correct.
That's the current model. I just want to be really specific on how it's working. So the theory today, the model that we're using, the hybrid model is there's school 4 days a week.
Correct.
2 days a week you can go in person.
Correct.
And 2 days a week you dial in.
Synchronously, yes.
But it's for 100% of the students.
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure I've got that part right, because now what I want to make sure I'm understanding is, so this doesn't say that the dial-in goes away. This just says that it's 100% in person, and I'm still lost. It's confusing to me.
So what it boils down to is, if we were to move to a full 100% in-person learning schedule, you still have the in-person and the synchronous component of that classroom.
But that's where I'm confused. What you just said is what's confusing me, because this says, and I can appreciate some of the response you're getting from teachers, oh my goodness, 100% in person. this doesn't indicate that you're going to continue having dial-in.
I think where we have to, and this is great that we're unpacking this, we have to define what option is really available. So,
Good.
and this is partly why we did not send anything out to families yet, because we have not been clear to say that when you signed up for a hybrid schedule, that's really in-person learning. So by virtue of moving to a 4-day in-person instructional model, does that mean that I am no longer able to dial in synchronously either 2 days a week or 4 days a week, or essentially what is the option? Now I will tell you on the flip side of this, what we're going to have is a question from the standpoint of what are my expectations as a teacher for the kids that may end up choosing to be in person versus the ones that are choosing to be synchronous. We need to unpack that in more detail, because synchronous learning is not necessarily a full-blown class period of everything that everybody in the in-person environment is doing is the same thing that everybody in the synchronous environment is doing. It's just impossible to manage it that way. So my terminology, and please weigh in and support me on this, we're not asking teachers to create a synchronous 2.0. We're not trying to say that you have to do synchronous learning different than what you're already doing. We can honor choice. I think we're not expecting that every single student or family will elect to have their children attending 100% in-person learning. But the question then becomes, so what exactly is the expectation around synchronous during that time? For whatever reason the student is in that position. It could be a quarantine. It could be that they just can't come to school. It could be that they're not comfortable. All of those things apply, and that creates an element of, okay, how do we make sure that our kids are still getting access to good core quality instruction? Because I would make an argument right now that says synchronous learning is not necessarily the substitute for in-person. It's the best we can do to keep kids moving on the path that they're currently in within the classroom. Anything I'm missing on that?
I think when you consider what happens in an in-person environment, so when you think about your hands-on experiences, those are very challenging to replicate in a synchronous environment. So that when we talk about how we're going to help teachers plan for some students who attend in person daily and students who attend synchronously daily, that we're not asking them to shift instruction, but it is going to be something that we're going to have to help work through, as well as the spacing within the classroom, the pods, those sorts of things.
Okay, let's stay on. I agree with all this.
Well, it all matters in instructional planning.
I get all of that. I really do. I'm talking about this communication.
Okay.
And I want to stay pretty pointed on it. And that is, so I could read this and say, as a parent, if this came to me and it said, okay, well, starting on the 22nd, we're returning to 100% in-person learning. I don't want my kids going to that crowded classroom. So I want them to be able to dial in. Does that mean I have to go to your asynchronous online?
No.
Well, that's not what this says. That's what I'm saying to you guys. That when I read it, and then I read the replies, it seems to me everybody's saying this is 100% in person. And I don't think that's what you're saying.
It's not.
But that's what I'm reading.
But the audience was not our families. So I want to be clear, because we didn't go, at some level, we have to make the separation. What are the implications for teachers? And then what are the implications from a student-family perspective? So that's something that we still, and I think later on in there said, we're still sorting that piece of things out.
I'm just talking about the bold sentence.
Okay, that's fair. But there's a bullet right underneath that says we still have to account for the fact that there's going to be choice within that process.
And flex varieties. I see that. But that bold sentence says 100%, and there's no other. If it's 100%, it's in person.
Well, for a teacher, it respectfully is not the same dynamic, right? So I hear what I'm in agreement with you, and
yeah, but semantically, I get what you're saying too. That this hybrid has been in-person learning. I get what you're saying.
Yep.
But it doesn't change the fact that I was confused.
Fair. So here's the thing. Is there still hybrid if we're moving back to 100% in person? So in other words, can I choose what days I'm going to be in person and what days I'm not going to be in person? That would be one of the questions, I think, that just is a
What's the choice? Exactly. What is the choice?
So, may I? given that there's probably less than 4 choices, it wouldn't be hard to build a very simple, easy to absorb matrix that says, look, if you're a student, here are your choices. If you're a teacher, here is your choice or choices, depending on how that goes. But it appears to me the real challenge here is, and let me take half a step back, everything Chris said is right. What the team has done to get us to here is phenomenal. It's likely in the top 1 to 5% of the performances in our state. So, first of all, congratulations. Secondly, to try to make a significant decision that has both safety and quality of life and educational impact on 7,000 people, if you include the staff, with a mosaic of cloudy, at best, data, is a challenge. That being said, this is what leaders do, and this is why we're all here, right? And it will not be without controversy. It will not be without valid objection. But at some juncture, we do have to make a decision and abide by it, right? And so my first question based on that framework is, it's been probably more than a dozen hours since you released this to our staff. What are they thinking?
That February 22nd may be too early.
Do they think there's a date that isn't too early?
Excellent question. I think the vaccination plan, as we described it, could be a linchpin. So while we didn't ask what date are you comfortable with, I think there would be I would guesstimate that a prevalence of our staff would prefer that we look a little bit later.
So here's another question then. Do we have the capacity and or the flexibility to move the end of the school year to the right?
That would not be our... do we have the flexibility? Theoretically, yes. In practical terms, no.
Okay.
There's a reality of number of days, of contracted days. There's a cost impact to that decision.
Right. But my question was, do you make... Sorry, Chris.
Well, to your first point, he wanted a simple 3 or 4 choice thing. What is your response to that?
So, although I understand that it's perceived that there are now a variety of choices, the choices for some of our online programs were already made. So students who are in the asynchronous online at the high school, or in the online program at the middle school, or in the elementary, we have dates associated with those enrollments because of staffing implications. So really the choice that you're talking about is the synchronous attendance to what other students are doing in person.
So the choice is, do I go 2 days a week, or can I go 3 days a week, or 4 days a week, or do I dial in every day? Is that...
I think you're getting to a very granular conversation that we have not yet completely fleshed out.
Okay.
I think to frame it really concretely, though, it's either are you going to be in person or are you going to be synchronously engaged in the classroom?
And they're still both available.
Yeah.
Yes.
In this scenario, the way I understand it, and by the way, I haven't seen the letter yet because of email challenges, so at your convenience, please resend. But, and maybe it's an advantage at this juncture, but it sounds to me like the choices for a secondary student are, I either attend 4 days a week or I do asynchronous 4 days a week.
Synchronous.
I apologize.
No, you're fine.
In sync with the classroom.
Correct.
Live interaction online. Right?
Correct.
And
Okay,
Flex
and
Fridays are 100% flex.
They're
still?
100% asynchronous except for students who need to be in building for a variety of reasons.
Which could, those who dialed in might. I don't know.
There are lots of options there.
Right. But it's flex for that purpose.
Correct.
For others.
Yeah.
But back to if I may, are we okay to move over back towards dates and things like that? Chris, I don't want to cut the piece you're on short.
Well, sure. I'm going with the memo that says it's going to be on the 22nd. So are we now asking whether or not we're going to do it on that date? Is that what you're
Well, when I began that process, but I inadvertently really stopped the momentum you had, so I apologize for that. My question really was, is there some scientific logic around pushing that back a week or so if vaccines are going to have a significant impact on the teaching staff in a positive manner? And my example was, do you take spring break and make it 2 weeks and take the week prior, which may be highly disruptive, but as an example, and we provide that cushion, and then we begin the day after spring break and we go a week later or whatever. But more importantly is, if we're going to have 8 out of 10 teachers vaccinated, which is the estimate at this juncture, is a week potentially going to have a significant positive impact? That's really what I'm trying to attempt to get your thoughts on and assess.
But Ron, I'm hearing you say delay the 22nd a week or so. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm saying, is it worth considering based on the staff's concerns?
And I would counter that with, what about bringing it up a week to the 15th? Because on the 13th and 14th, there's this event that everyone may get their shot at.
I would say that we need additional time to work through some of the details that you asked us about. And part of it, too, is that we've asked for feedback from staff. We want to know what their concerns and considerations are. We want to know what supports they need. We want to know if they need support going into a classroom to figure out how to configure their classroom differently to help with pods.
And that's coming, right? That is coming.
Yes, that's currently, yes.
Because you just started yesterday, so
Yes.
It's too early to ask any questions, but it's coming.
Yes.
So may I throw out one quick thing? And then Tiffany, it's all yours. I think the one thing I've neglected to consider, and I wonder if others have too, is how many staff do we have of our 400 or so teachers that are in K through 6? What percentage of the staff is K through 6? Roughly.
Bob, do you have a good read on that? I want to say about half.
I'm going to say 30.
About 50%. It's about 50-50.
And so, right, and with respect to the under 10 and over 10 metrics that we have been watching in terms of capacity to get the disease and or spread it, in general, how's the health been for that cohort of our team since we've been back in school? Not just since Christmas, but the whole year, because they've been back in school pretty much all year, right?
Correct. Elementary is in 100% in person, except
5
for students
days.
who are enrolled in our online.
All 5 days.
Correct.
Yeah. And so in general, what's the risk factor those teachers are performing under?
The reason that our elementary schools have been able to be in person 100% of the time is their cohorts are naturally small. So when a student or a teacher or any adult is identified as a positive member, the impact is reduced because they can contain it. And a lot of our practices have been around containing classrooms, keeping them separate. So we've been able to minimize the impact of a sick person. In the high schools and middle school, that is impossible to do because the bell rings and they just scatter. And so I would say that the impact is considerably lower in the elementary schools. Even though our numbers are not, our impact is because of our ability to tighten out those cohorts down to a very small number of people. And that's the single biggest challenge about running a middle school or a high school is what every single child has a different schedule. So theoretically, half the school could be impacted by one kid who's in 8 different classes with 30 kids in each class. I mean, it's impossible to contain that. That's been the challenge from the very first day.
But we get some, don't we get, isn't it fair to say we get some of that dynamic in the elementary schools from what the families are exposed to at home?
Absolutely, siblings and of course our
Or extracurricular activities,
elective
or
teachers.
where their families
Yeah.
have been?
But by no means are we doing it perfectly,
Yeah.
but it is much, we're able to do so at a much higher capacity at our elementaries, and
Yeah.
the impact has been significantly reduced because of our ability to do so. And we have made substantial changes in how school looks at the elementary level as well, in order to maximize the protection for kids.
How have the teachers fared through this?
Well, there's been some teachers who have been sick and have been deeply impacted by their health. There have been other teachers who have been quarantined for multiple weeks. We've had individual teachers. They tend to be teachers who don't have a single classroom who have been impacted 3-4 times and have been on quarantine 3-4 times. So it is impacting them, I would say, fairly substantially.
Okay. Thank you. Just trying to get some level of comparison, because we do have some data here, right? Yes, the scenario is different, but we still have teachers in the classroom 5 days a week, students in the classroom 5 days a week. We don't know what they're doing when they're outside the classroom, so if there's a potential for them to bring something in that is active, and that's more of the scenario you're describing in the high school, which is this dynamic interactivity that we've all been raised with in our educational society, right? And hopefully this wasn't anecdotal, but it gives us at least a reference point.
Well, in an example, our single biggest quarantine challenge happened right before the winter break when we were at our peak. And it happened because of multiple family members in elementary school on the same bus. And we ended up having to take everybody on that bus, including the driver and everybody else, and put them on a lengthy quarantine. And that had a substantial impact on that school's ability to function for the remaining 2 weeks. And the reason it was so uniquely difficult is if we quarantine a second grade class, Miss Jones' second grade class, Miss Jones is out, as are Miss Jones' students. So they just shift to a remote learning, and it's fairly clean. But when you have a bus that goes out, and you have 3 kids in Miss Jones' class, 3 kids in Miss Smith's class, and it's spread out, of course, across the entire building, now those teachers are trying to figure out how they're going to meet those kids who are in quarantine, plus the kids in person, and that became extremely challenging for that unique school. So those are the pieces that I think it's hard for us to account for. How much impact is a basketball game going to have, or a bus ride, or a lunchroom? And those are the real challenges that we're going to face if we double the population in our buildings.
So to build on what Ron was saying, this data from the elementary schools and how does it might apply to secondary. Another point of view might be the current synchronous model is new this semester. So what data do you have from last semester in the secondary schools, and how does this semester look in comparison?
We did do a grade analysis for the high schools in particular, comparing fall of 19 to fall of 2020. We were pleasantly surprised at the grade distribution in terms of majority of students fared better, believe it or not, academically as a whole, obviously individual variance there. We also looked at the data with our online program.
Better before or after, I'm sorry.
In 2020, because there was intentional intervention based on response to students' needs. You're right, we don't have the right data yet, because the first few weeks within a semester, you'll see a lot of grade variance because one typical grade can vary the grade quite a bit. So we start looking at that at about 5 to 6 weeks in, because you have had, unit assessments and that sort
You're
of thing.
barely there.
Correct.
Right.
Is it fair to say, though, that anecdotally, we are hearing positive reviews
Absolutely.
from a majority of teachers and even from students that have appreciated the daily engagement that the synchronous coupled with the in-person learning has provided? I think it's helped create more sustainability or routine. So I think by and large, because there was a lot of feedback from first semester that said, this is not working, and that was the major adjustment that we made from first into second semester.
And from a parent, it is working better. guarantee you this semester is better than last semester. I was going more along the lines of risk, though, and the exposure. Has there been any change in that in terms of?
Not favorably. I actually was hoping for a greater change than what we've had because the county prevalence was so high in the fall. But I can tell you, as of today, we've had 27 total cases at Lewis Palmer High School alone. We've had 10
Total since for the school year or just this year?
Since January.
Just since January. Thank
Yeah,
you.
since we've returned to that second week in January.
Right.
Palmer Ridge has had 10, and the middle school has had 4. So we have not seen a decrease in prevalence of positive cases in our schools like I was hoping.
And isn't there more exposure in this model?
There is.
So even though there's more exposure, how does that compare then? Because of additional exposure risk, the numbers you would expect to be a little bit higher, but are they proportionally higher because of the additional exposure?
No, I would say, I mean Bear Creek is a great school to compare with just because of its size. Bear Creek has had 6, and Lewis Palmer High School has had 27, just for a comparison. So we are seeing a substantially higher number in our high schools.
Well, and isn't that what we're talking about with the change that we're talking about now is more exposure?
Right.
Right.
And then the more kids in school is more impact per exposure. So I'm spending as much time in the quarantine side of this factor as I am the actual number of kids who are sick.
Understood.
I mean, both of those.
That's our biggest, I still think that's going to be the biggest issue going forward. So it's fair to say that we went from fall semester to this semester in this hybrid synchronous learning, which increased the exposure of kids. Because they're at school with more people more often. And if we take this next step, then we're going to increase the exposure further. Is that a
Yes.
fair?
Yes.
That's what we're really saying.
That is the risk we are concerned about.
Right.
Yes.
And please, Teresa.
I might have missed it. How did the increase in exposure occur since we've gone from asynchronous to synchronous hybrid?
I think there were two different ways we were interpreting that question, Teresa. We were basing the increase in exposure to where we were when we were in completely distance, not the asynchronous to synchronous. So.
Okay, we didn't step up from, I see, because from Thanksgiving to Christmas, we were entirely online.
Correct.
Okay, I understand. And Chris, just while I'm off, while I'm talking, it's worth thinking about in the context of all of these conversations that to the extent that the schools have been able to remain open is, as I understand it, reflected by local community behavior as well. So there's that component as well.
Agreed. And I appreciate that comment. And it fits right into where I'm going with this. So let's assume for a moment that on the 22nd, we make this move, which isn't fully defined yet. Because you really haven't given parents the choices of dialing in or coming to class. It's not going to be 100% in person.
Correct.
Those who dial in are not considered 100% in person,
That's
even
correct.
though they're in the same model, if you will. Okay?
Correct.
But we're going to increase the risk further. And the risk that we have is this quarantine and this contact tracing. That's the risk. The risk is 1 week later, we shut down both schools. Is that not a fair statement?
That is absolutely a fair statement.
That's the risk. I mean, yes, we can talk about the individual cases and the risk that the individual has. And believe me, I don't discount any of that. But what we're really talking about in this move is increasing the risk of exposure. And the first effect of it is going to be shutting down those schools or moving back to where we were in November. Is that not the result of this, if indeed?
There is a potential of that.
Can I lead?
Hence, having said what I just said, then that to me means all the more reason we maintain this current hybrid model. It's just where you're sitting. And the question then becomes, if contact tracing and so forth says, well, we can't meet in person, so then you continue it dialing in. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? In the model you're in today, what if you just said, okay, it's 100% in person, but you're going to sit at home? You could say the same thing, right?
In theory.
In theory. That's not what I don't think any parents are asking for. But if we do this move, and then because of contact tracing and the rules that apply, we shut down the schools, that's where we'll be.
I think to back that point up, that would be one of the concerns we would anticipate from some parents, which are going to already anticipate, my kid was quarantined X number of times first semester, now you're just bringing in double the number of kids potentially. So therefore, my risk for quarantine becomes that much greater. Therefore, why would I want to send my kid into that environment? I would prefer not to. And I think perhaps what we're touching on without bottom lining this right now is we don't know how many of our parents or students are thinking one way or another. So that seems to be some important information to be able to gather. I'm going to translate that into however we're developing an update and a letter to our families, that needs to be included in that process of giving us feedback. What would be your preference given all of those facts, the understanding that that's exactly the situation you're walking into? Sorry.
No, that was going to be a question I had. You just touched on it. So my concern with starting on the 22nd is the logistics of it. That seems like that's a short window for teachers and staff and families to switch gears very quickly, and we are a district of choice. We're a district where we want people to see us as the choice option, and we're a district where we want to ensure that families have the choice to have their students be educated in an environment that's best suited for each individual student. And so to your point, Chris, what you're saying, with the 100%, if I understand, you're saying families should have the choice of, if you want to be in those 4 days, you can. If you don't feel comfortable and you want to still continue with the hybrid, you can. If you want to be online, you can. But that still takes logistics to get there, and I don't want to set us up for failure, and I do think that we need to make sure families are aware that if we do this, not if, when we do this, there is absolutely, indeed, a higher potential for your student to be in quarantine more. And that's not because we want them in quarantine. That's because we don't get a choice. That is not our choice to make.
Those are the rules.
Those are the rules.
They can relax them. Those are the rules.
Those are the rules, yeah. And so as a parent who has had my child in quarantine, I swear sometimes she's in quarantine more than she's in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's because of outside of school contact, sometimes it's from school contact. She has not ever tested positive, but she's been in quarantine because those are the rules. I've also coming from the perspective of somebody who has lost loved ones to COVID, I am very sensitive in understanding the concern with starting too early as well. At the same time, as you said, Casey, if we can, we should. So my question is, where is that balance? Where's that tightrope balance, and how do we as leaders make sure that we are doing the best we can to be good stewards to our students, their families, and our staff and their families? And I wanted to make a real quick clarification. It was the CDC director that made the statement. It's not their official position yet. Their official position is that they published a study last month that showed that there's little evidence of the virus spreading in schools in the United States when precautions are taken, such as wearing masks, social distancing, and ventilation. And that social distancing piece is the part of it that is the most difficult. And then I also asked the question, well, are our students still being social outside of school? So are they actually adhering to cohorts when they're not in our physical buildings? So there's a lot of factors to weigh here, and that's why you're our leader.
Tiffany, I just want to totally appreciate everything you just said and the insights it adds. But the other the other factor that I don't think we've really spent nearly enough time on, and I don't know how you measure this, is what's the impact on our kids for the last
Well, that's what
11 months?
That's what I was about to, yeah.
I don't think we appreciate
Well, that's
how
what,
bad this is.
well, that's what I was about to say. The other piece of it, too, as a parent, is this whole year is lost. And that's, as a mama bear, that's tough. And I know I'm not the only one in that. And so I want my children, my elementary school students still in school, but I want to see our secondary children. I don't want this to be an entirely lost year. I want us to do this when we can, as soon as we can.
Yeah, are we going to have a prom?
Possibly. Possibly.
So I want our kids in school, and I don't think that waiting till spring break, I think spring break is March 22nd. That's too far, in my opinion. If you, just to be blunt and give my opinion. But is February 22nd a little too soon, logistically speaking, and making sure that tightrope is walked?
Well, in some ways, I think KC has already made that decision in conjunction with principals and admin and so forth. I mean, you sent the letter out. Now, is it chiseled in stone? Perhaps not. Maybe there's whatever wiggle room you need needs to be there. But as I'm understanding this, after this conversation, as a parent, I can continue to have my kids do exactly what they're doing until spring break. But what you're saying here, again, as I understand it, as a parent, if I want to, I can send them every day.
Correct.
Yeah, this is really more of a staff issue.
It is. And, well, logistics. Staff and logistics.
It's the logistics.
And safety,
Yeah.
from their standpoint, right?
Coming back to that February 22nd date, that was setting a goalpost that I don't want to necessarily be in a position where we're moving, well,
It's now
not going to
public.
move up any sooner, let's put it that way.
And it's now public.
But it needed to be stated, I think, in that way. And granted, I can put my hand up in the air and say if it was too soon from several people's perspective, that's certainly their opinion of that. Is there rationale that would support a delay of a couple of weeks? Sure, there is. But I also come back to, well, we could play that game all the way out from now until the end of the year.
Sure.
And there is a bias that I have that is about getting our kids back. That has to be our goal. And it means 100%. And I will go on record, and I will have this conversation with anybody. I don't feel like a hybrid schedule is necessarily what's best for our kids. And that we have done what we've done in order to be as responsible and as sustainable in the educational process that we can provide this entire time. This is not the long-term solution. And ideally, we can get back sooner. So that is why I'm not going to apologize for saying February 22nd. With all due respect to all of my colleagues, there was a reason we put that date out there. Now, I think what we have to back that up with is family communication to get a better understanding from our families. Now, what are your preferences or preference? It's pretty simple. Will you go back to 100%, or do you not feel comfortable? And if that's the case, synchronous is your other option.
And we really have to make sure that we maintain synchronous because the risks are going to go higher because of the exposure and the protocols we can't keep, the 6-foot distancing. The risks are going to go up. That could require, if we follow EPC, a lot of homeschool.
Yeah.
So we can't go back 100% in person.
That's correct.
And it's just an interpretation, if you will, but that's the way I read it. And that's not what we're going to do. I don't think that's what you're suggesting.
That is not what thank you for that.
We have to maintain what we're doing. We're just opening the door to move back to more opportunity to be in class.
I think we've summarized it. Or really gone into a lot of depth with it, which I appreciate. Is there any other
I'm good.
input or?
I understand, and I am glad you're making these decisions, Casey. I'm glad you're the leader here because you're excellent. And I honestly mean that, because when you look at this situation, there are school districts that have been closed all year in this country. And we haven't. We're in good shape. And the ability to make this transition only exists because of everything you've been doing all year.
And I would echo, thank you for that our staff are definitely carrying a huge load. I don't want to call it a burden, but I know it feels that way sometimes. This is not at all about creating more difficulty just to... The one thing I will want to call out just publicly, there has been allusion to the fact that there's some ulterior motive here. How can there be an ulterior motive when we're talking about our kids and we're talking about their education? So I'm offended by that. And I appreciate that people on the receiving end may feel offended that this communication was not what they wanted to hear. But if I'm going to be blamed for an ulterior motive, it's about our kids first and foremost. And that's it. So thank you. Thank you for that feedback. And let's keep going at this, because that's the push and that's the focus. And I rest my case there.
All right, Dr. Summers.
Thank you.
Is that your update?
It is.
It was awesome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with Ron today for board member comments.
I actually have none. I think what we went through was the clear, most important thing, and the reason we're here is to educate our children. But I do want to just double check, since we have two peers on the phone, to make sure when we close that section that they had any open items or questions, that maybe we ask them if they have anything else on this topic. If that's
They will
okay.
during their comments, yes.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Did you have anything else?
That's all.
Tiffany?
No, sir.
Not at all. You're good.
I'm good.
Teresa?
I don't have any additional comments.
Matt?
I do. I just want to say I appreciate my fellow board members' insight, as well as the time and effort Dr. Summers has put into this. This is a challenging issue, in the sense that no matter what is decided here, there's going to be someone that's unhappy. But I think hopefully everyone realizes that our motives are pure, and the intent is to do what's best for our kids. And I understand that different people will have different perceptions of that. But with that being said, I support Dr. Summers and his proposed recommendation, and I'm looking forward to moving forward.
Cool. Thank you, Matt.
I second that.
Yeah, amen. So I'm gonna close with this, and that is, in March a year ago, there was a lot of diverse opinion then too. And in August, there was a lot of diverse opinion. In fact, I want to express my gratitude for all of those who express their opinions, because I've heard, I think, the full gamut of opinions throughout this school year, more than I've ever heard in the previous 3 years. I appreciate it. I really do. And I think Dr. Summers does as well. And I've learned a lot from Dr. Summers as he seeks to understand those opinions. And he evaluates them, and he helps weigh those perspectives into decisions for this school system. This school system isn't run by an individual or a child or a parent. This is a system. And I appreciate the fact that we have a superintendent that walks the talk of our system goals without fail. And I want to say that publicly. I appreciate that I can say things to Dr. Summers that are out of left field. And he's never put me down for asking silly questions. He seeks to understand. And as he seeks to understand me, I get to understand myself better. And I hope the board members feel the same way. I feel the same way when I seek to understand each of the board members. It's helpful, because then I understand where they're coming from. And at the end of the day, I believe that 99% of the people that live in this community want the same thing. If we could seek to understand one another more, these difficult decisions wouldn't be so difficult. And frankly, we need to learn to give a little grace. It may not be my way, but it's definitely the best way the community can come together and do this. So thank you, Dr. Summers, for your leadership again. And thank you, board members, for your time, your commitment, your thoughtful questions. I think today's discussion was as illuminating as possible. And with that, we'll adjourn till the 22nd at 6 p.m.
And I'm excited to have my kids back in school.
You've made your choice.
Thank you all.